Good evening. It's wonderful to see all of you. I am Michael Cooper White, and for almost a year now I have had the great privilege of being the interim president here at Brite Divinity School. It's my great honor to welcome all of you here tonight. There are folks in this room whom I have heard about, read about for years, and tonight it's my privilege to be meeting some of them for the first time. We are in for a fantastic evening of presentation, an address, conversation, and just enjoying this fellowship. One of the fantastic gifts of Brite Divinity School is its depth and breadth of reach to faith communities. The Board of Trustees and the faculty held a joint retreat this past weekend, and in the course of that, among other things, we celebrated, we think, Brite may be unique in the world of Christian divinity schools and seminaries in having a Jewish member of our Board of Trustees, and that's Red Goldstein over here, who has brought so many gifts, as have others of you in this community. We are on the verge this weekend of Rosh Hashanah, beginning of the Jewish New Year. Means literally head of the year. And I think tonight's gathering is perhaps points toward new beginnings, the possibilities that we may be on the verge of next community. Hopefully in this nation there will be signs of hope as well as an assessment of reality as we gather this evening. So it's now my privilege and honor to introduce the one whom I succeeded, Brite Divinity School's President Emeritus, Reverend Dr. Newell Williams, along with Reverend Dr. Robert Welch, President Emeritus of the Christian Unity and Interfaith Ministry. Thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone for coming.
I am honored, along with Newell, to share in this occasion of tribute to Joe and Nancy Stalcup as part of the 17th Stalcup Lecture on Christian Unity. This would be the 10th lecture that I've been part of, going way back to 1999 when I became president of what was called the Council on Christian Unity. And I've been privileged to work with and work closely with both Joe and Nancy in helping to select the person and the topic for each of the lectures. The Stalcup Lectureship, as you will note on the back of your program, the Stalcup Lectures began in 1991. The first one began at East Dallas Christian Church, where I grew up as in my Christian faith. The first lecturer was an ordained disciple woman, Joan Brown Campbell, who at that time was the president, general secretary of the National Council of Churches. I hope each of you will review the full listing of Stalcup lectures that is included in this, in tonight's program booklet. It's a remarkable, even amazing list of individuals and topics that have been part of this for 32 years, all representing Joe and Nancy's vision and understanding of the calling to Christian unity. The lectures have included a rich diversity of presenters, the full inclusion of women and men, representing the diversity of racial and ethnic perspectives, of local, national, and international religious leaders and scholars, and of lectures by persons of different faith traditions. It's an amazing list when you look at the names and the topics that they have covered. Indeed, this is my tribute to Joe and Nancy Stalcup, that this important lectureship has offered significant understandings of and contributions to the vision of Christian unity today, which must embrace and include a larger vision of the unity of all persons and of all faiths and religions, so that the world might know and believe that there is but one family, the human family, and that family must learn to live and love as sisters and brothers together in this fragile home we call the earth. Thank you for inviting me.
Good evening. My name is Newell Williams, and I am President Emeritus of Brite Divinity School. It has been my pleasure to work with Nancy Stalcup and the late Joe Stalcup in the development of the School of Theology for the Laity. It was in the late 1970s that Joe and Nancy had the dream of providing a cutting-edge theological school for the laity, the kind of theological education that one could receive at graduate theological schools such as Brite Divinity School and Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. In fact, this vision was directly related to Nancy's quest for greater theological understanding as the spouse of a seminarian. And who was that? Joe Stalcup, her husband, who, having become a very successful real estate attorney, pursued a Master of Divinity degree at Perkins in order to become more helpful to the church as an ordained minister of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. It was through the generosity and fundraising of Joe and Nancy that this bold initiative eventually became a program of Brite Divinity School and was named at the requirement of the Brite Board of Trustees that this school, that continues to this day, this school would be named the Stalcup School of Theology for the Laity. Behind all of Nancy and Joe's service and initiatives in the life of the church was their faith that God is at work to make a better world. May it be so. Nancy and Joe's niece, Dr. Carol Stalcup, is representing the family this evening. Would you please stand and receive a token, a sign of
I thank you all for having been so faithful to us through the years. We've enjoyed every moment of it, and we wish you the best in the future and keep on learning.
In addition to being committed to the unity of the church and the unity of humankind, Joe A. and Nancy Vaughn Stalcup are strong advocates of the ministry of the laity and the priesthood of all believers. Joe A. and Nancy Vaughn Stalcup hope that this lecture series bearing their names will witness now and to eternity their firm belief that all of us are one in Christ Jesus. Joe and Nancy also hope that their gifts to the Stalcup School of Theology for the Laity will witness now and to posterity their strong conviction that faith-seeking understanding is a vital task for the whole people of God. We really appreciate the time and energy that you've put into the school over these years. Thank you so much, all of you.
Well, esteemed guests and the scholars and the talented students of Brite Divinity School and Texas Christian University, along with our esteemed colleges and cherished friends from the ecumenical and interfaith communities spanning the greater Fort Worth and Dallas area, tonight signifies a momentous occasion in the legacy of this lecture series as we convene for the Joe A. and Nancy Stalcup lecture on Christian unity, now hosted here at Brite Divinity School, having transitioned from East Dallas Christian Church. It is also a remarkable milestone as we reunite in person, marking our first in-person gathering since the 2019 lecture. And also, this is the very first time that we invited the Jewish scholar to be a speaker for this lecture tonight. As we gather this evening, we pause to pay a tribute to the memory of Joe Stalcup, whose steadfast commitment we celebrate today. His commitment to our shared ideals continued until his passing last year. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to Reverend Dr. Welsh and Reverend Dr. Williams for their touching tributes to Joe Stalcup this evening. Although we wish Nancy Stalcup could be with us tonight, due to her health reasons, she couldn't attend the lecture. Yet we sense her spirit among us tonight. It is with a great honor and anticipation that I introduce today's distinguished speaker, Rabbi David Saperstein, who will be delivering the 17th Joe and Nancy Stalcup lecture. Rabbi Saperstein's illustrious career has earned him accolades from various corners, notably being designated by Newsweek magazine as the most influential rabbi in America.
It was actually an interview with my mother.
And then also he is recognized by the Washington Post as the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill. For 4 decades, Rabbi Saperstein served as a director of the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, effectively representing the Reformed Jewish movement, the largest segment of the American Jewry, to both Congress and the administration. During the second term of the Obama administration, Rabbi Saperstein took on the role of the United States ambassador at large for international religious freedom. In this capacity, he was the country's chief diplomat on religious freedom issues, advising Secretary Kerry and President Obama. His commitment to religious freedom extended globally, making him America's advocate for religious freedom worldwide. Rabbi Saperstein's influence extends beyond his religious and diplomatic roles. He is an accomplished attorney, having taught seminars on church-state law and comparative Jewish American law for 35 years at Georgetown University Law Center. Today, he continues his academic work as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Foreign Service School and Center for Jewish Civilization. He also holds the position of Distinguished Fellow at the P.M. Glenn Institute at Australian Catholic University. Throughout his career, Rabbi Saperstein has chaired national interreligious coalitions, served on the boards of numerous national organizations, and been recognized with countless awards and honorary doctorate. In his latest book, Jewish Dimensions of Social Justice, Top Moral Choices for Our Times, Rabbi Saperstein continues to explore critical issues at the intersection of faith and society. And ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to welcome Rabbi David Saperstein to our lecture today. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Rabbi Saperstein, and thank you for joining us for this special occasion.
First, I just want to say that, is this working all right? You able to hear me? Yeah? In the back too? Right. I've been fighting laryngitis for about a month, and you have a tendency, if you don't hear the mic, to try to project through. So I don't want to do that if I don't need to. So it is, it's really an honor and pleasure to be here. And I want to particularly express my appreciation, not for the reason that you might think, which are manifold here, but for the fact that I know Amal Clooney is speaking across the street, and every one of you who chose to be here, I know it's to honor the Stalcups far more than to hear me, but it is really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I never knew Joe Stalcup, actually, obviously, but clearly his abiding appreciation for fostering interfaith relations and his vision of creating opportunities for lay people and the scholars that you brought in. What an extraordinary list of people have preceded me. I'm doubly honored for that. Is really a lasting legacy for this lectureship in the Dallas-Fort Worth community, wherever it's held, but now that it's at Brite here this year, I hope it will continue at least periodically in that regard. And what a wonderful thing to have brought these two, the family, the Stalcup family, and this extraordinary institution together. I want to express my appreciation to Paul Che and to Rowena Tard, who helped shape all the logistics of my being here. And I'm really honored. I know that all of the people that we've heard from here, and a number we haven't heard from yet. Ariel Feldman is here. Look, any professor of Jewish studies, always an honor for me. But to bear the name of Rosa Manny Rosenthal is especially sweet for me, it makes it even more of a delight. And my dear friend and distinguished colleague, Ralph Mecklenburg, together with all those that we've heard from, thank you for all you do to serve this community, to lead these institutions. What a gift to this community and to the nation. The national denomination I work with and the Disciples of Christ at a national level on social justice issues has always worked closely together. And that makes it especially an additional thing. I feel like Kosi Ravaya, my cup runneth over here. And I always enjoy being in Texas, which is a living embodiment of all of the national contradictions and paradoxical aspects of American life in 2023 that I'll be discussing. I was asked to address the growing divisions in America, manifested as they are in the growing instances of hate speech and hate crimes, of anti-Semitism and religious rancor, tensions between religious freedom claims and civil rights claims, each passionately asserted by those who make such of those claims, and the resulting impacts of all of this, both good and concerning, on the state of interfaith relations in America, and all of that seen through the filter of the changing constitutional doctrine of the Roberts Supreme Court, and to get it all done in 40 minutes. I presume many of you, if I were a disciplined disciple of Christ, I would just have cut my speech in half. Being a Jewish kid from Brooklyn, I'm just going to talk twice as fast here. I know that many of you share my sense that we're at a crossroads in the direction America will take on issues of democracy, fundamental rights, America's diversity, the meaning of religious freedom in the 21st century. Broad but fascinating agenda, so let's get to it. There are two different routes, two different distinct narratives of America as far as religion is concerned. One founding story goes like this: an oppressed people fleeing persecution to a promised land, crossing through a wilderness, entering into a covenant with God, creating a new nation in that promised land that would be based entirely on God's laws. That would be not the ancient children of Israel, but as you all know, the Puritans. Fleeing persecution in Europe, crossing the Atlantic watery wilderness, entering into the Mayflower Compact, establishing codes of law like the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts of 1650, the courts of New England of 1649, where every single law had a biblical citation. From your Old Testament, our Jewish scripture, of course, here, but every law was there. They believed that they were the new Israelites, creating in their promised land a new nation controlled by God's laws. This Christian focus, what would later be, by their terms, nativist thread, has been with us throughout our history, manifesting itself in events that, or dynamics that change religion in America. The Great Awakening of the 1700s that dotted the landscape of America with the local churches. 300,000 plus houses of worship, the most common public building in America today. And the Great Awakening of the mid-1800s that led to the creation of our denominational system, which itself is under such enormous strains today. So too it infused the early 20th century rise of new denominational evangelical and Pentecostal churches. Now, before getting to the obvious of how it manifested itself in the religious right and Christian nationalism, I just want to mention another thread that if you have not had a chance yet to take a look at Robbie Jones's new book, here, it is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy. I strongly commend it to you because he lifts up a strand of Christian kind of colonialist dominionism that preceded even the Puritans coming here. And that is a series of papal bulls that underlay the justification of Christian dominion over the unfolding discoveries in the New World. I'm going to give you, just for time, one vivid example. His whole book, though, is replete with documenting that this, what I'm giving you, was not an aberration, but a kind of norm. Pope Nicholas granting Portuguese King Alfonso the following rights. And listen carefully. Quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, subdue all Saracens, I presume Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed. And the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them are yours, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. We forget how ingrained this was. You know, take a look someday at the Declaration of Independence that objects to Britain's interference with our slave trade. Here, you will see, actually, even in the Declaration itself, here, really disturbing threads of some of these common themes here. And that was by no means isolated. A group of these laid out what is referred to as the doctrine of discovery. Although Catholic in origin, the mentality expressed was infused in much of the Christian colonialism that took place in the Western Hemisphere and across the globe, for that matter. It was a religious vision that resonates with America's two original sins, slavery and the genocidal destruction of Native Americans. Was that not an authorizing blueprint, what I read in that papal bull, exactly for that? And these strands of these two expressions, Puritan and Catholic, shaped the mid-20th century rise of the so-called religious right. This had a Catholic origin. It doesn't mean it was normative throughout Catholic history here, but it was a moment, a crucial moment here that affected what happened here here, even if the Catholic Church went in other directions later. Here. And it has infused the religious right, whose presence has shaped American politics, particularly Republican politics, ever since. In many cases, manifested within the bounds of American constitutional norms, but increasingly in recent years, in extreme forms, pushing right through those boundaries. This is particularly seen in contemporary white Christian nationalism strands, while primarily in segments of evangelical Christianity is pulling people from many different religious backgrounds to it. And you know the basic propositions that they are asserting. America was founded as a Christian country. Christianity was intended to hold and should continue to hold a special status today and in the future. That only laws, policies, behavior that can be reconciled with their view of Christianity ought to be passed to become the norm in American life. And only such steps can make America great again. The rhetoric, policy program, political assertions of the Christian nationalist agenda sounds more like a theocracy at times than it does a democracy. And the problem with theocracy is that everyone wants to be Theo. And too often, you know, Jim Rudin, one of the premier interfaith leaders of the past 50 years, said what we're really looking is Christocrats here. That's what the Christian nationalist political agenda is. And too often, more extreme elements attribute their failure to win their views through the democratic processes of this country to conspiracies, which can explain why the self-evident truth of their position has not prevailed. It spills over beyond claims of stolen elections or efforts to engage in denial of voting rights to those they think will vote differently than they want, into conspiracy theories of extreme groups like QAnon with racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, homophobic overtones. We saw much of this in the behavior and messages of this January 6 rioters. A giant cross erected on the Capitol steps, flags and banners emblazoned with Christian symbols and messages of Proud Boys engaged in their Christian prayer before attacking the rotunda and piercing into the rotunda itself, the center hall of the Congress, which, Robbie Jones points out in his book, is adorned itself. How many of you have been in the rotunda of the Capitol building? It's adorned with 4 major paintings, one of which is a picture of DeSoto landing in the conquest of wherever he landed first in Central America, I believe, here. And the 2 major symbols are the sword and the cross. Here, exactly what these people thought they were fighting for on January 6th. Consider what Christian nationalists and those who sympathize with them are fighting for. A romanticized notion of the past, of white privilege, of white male domination in a world that no longer exists, in a world that is changing faster than ever. Consider just how fast it's changing. In 1990, nearly 70% of Americans identified as both white and Christian. By 2008, when Obama took office, that had dropped to 56% of Americans identified as white Christians. Today, 15 years later, it has dropped to 42%. That world is gone. And there are lots of Christians who aren't white and lots of whites who aren't Christians. It isn't that either Christianity or whites are not a majority, but white Christians is a really shrinking. Not only the mainline Protestant denominations, but the evangelical denominations are also shrinking at this period of time. And such views pose a serious threat to traditional interfaith relations that are based on tolerance, pluralism, equal partnership, comedy. They stand in sharp contrast to the ever-growing interfaith cooperation in America I will come back to in a few moments. And where are the American people on these issues? Polling data on these views evoke contradictory responses. somewhat confusing responses when the big three religion and public life pollsters asked questions, being Pew, Gallup, and Robbie Jones's Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. For the sake of transparency, I should acknowledge that I served as the first board chair of PRRI. In a Pew Research poll last year, 60% of Americans said that the founders intended the country to be a Christian country. Only 28% of them said we should be declared a Christian country. 24% said it should feature Christian values, America, but 63% say America should advocate for values that are shared by many faiths. We should note it's totally not clear what people meant and heard by Christian country or Christian values. A more recent 2023 poll by PRI determined 10% embrace Christian nationalist beliefs, 19% are sympathetic to Christian national beliefs. That's a total of 29% of the overall population. 52% of Republicans are in that category. 56% of white evangelicals are in that category. All this despite the fact that the Constitution never mentioned Christianity, never mentioned Jesus. Its only mentions of religion are the ones in the First Amendment and in Article 6 here. And God, who appears in our aspirational declaration as the Creator who endowed us with our fundamental rights, is nowhere to be seen in the Constitution. So here's a question for avid Constitution readers. God actually does appear once in the Constitution. Bonus points for whoever can tell me where. Anyone? The last words of the Constitution in the year of our Lord, 1787. Here. Of course, the other, thankfully more normative strand of religion in America ran through Roger Williams' notion of separation of church and state, Maryland's tolerant embrace of Catholics, albeit not so friendly to Jews in the beginning, the comparative openness of the Pennsylvania Quakers to minority religions, all of it feeding into the founders, many of them deists who shaped our Declaration, Constitution, founding. It was the vision of Jefferson's Virginia statute on religious freedom. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor be enforced, restrained, molested, burdened in his body or goods, nor otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. We are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are the natural rights of mankind. Madison, in his memorial and remonstrance, wrote in similar terms in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, touching on an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And Article 6, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. Almost all believers in God, they created and affirmed the Constitution's ban on religious tests for office, its guarantee of free exercise, a ban on establishment, and the attendant notion of separation of church and state was embraced, creating, for the first time in human history, a nation in which one's rights as a citizen would not depend upon their religious identity, their religious beliefs, or their religious peaceful practices. And yes, like many of our promised rights, it took us a long time to get to the point where that promise became a reality, as we will see in a moment. It was only in the 1940s that the Supreme Court began an expansive interpretation of the religious clauses that made that promise real legally. And it was followed in response to powerful grassroots organizing, protesting, advocating across the nation by the court and the Congress's expansion of the rights of women and minorities that transformed America. For Jews, too, this was transformative. All along, the United States had offered a very different experience for Jews than they had known before. The state-sponsored, church-sponsored, academic-sponsored anti-Semitism church, state, academia, that was the norm in Christian Europe for nearly 1,500 years, was the exception in America, mostly relegated to the fringes of American religious, governmental, and academic sector once we got past the 1833 point that state establishments disappeared entirely in America. In every sense, America gave to the Jews, who after all, quite arguably, have been the quintessential victims of religious persecution and oppression, of banishments and exiles, of pogroms, and the Holocaust, the quintessential victims of human history of religious oppression. More rights, more freedoms, and more opportunities here than we have ever known in 2,500 years of diaspora life. And yet from the very beginning, there were also numerous expressions of anti-Semitism, beginning when Peter Stuyvesant tried to limit the citizens' rights of the very first Jews who landed in America in New Amsterdam in 1654. Or in the mid-1800s, when the Know Nothing Party, whose anti-Catholicism, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish worldview captured significant elements of America. There were white Christian nationalist supremacist aspects to the KKK, animating its racist and anti-Semitic ideology and actions into the end of the first half of the 20th century. And you can add to that Father Coughlin and his radio show, 30 million people said, when we get through with the Jews in America, they'll think the treatment they received in Germany was nothing. And Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford. Henry Ford managed to get awarded by 1938 by Adolf Hitler with the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle, the highest honor of the Nazis bestowed on any foreigner, in no small measure because of his anti-Semitism. But where Jews had in the early decades of the 20th century faced quotas limiting us in universities, in corporate boardrooms, banned from country clubs, here because of those transformative changes I was talking, in a very short period of time, American Jewry found itself in the mainstream of American academic, political, economic, and cultural life. So transformative were the political, legal, and cultural impacts of the post-World War II, post-Holocaust era, that we saw, along with the expansion of freedoms and opportunities for long marginalized segments of American society, that there was a dramatic increase in the percent of Americans who held anti-Semitic or racist attitudes. Indeed, according to the ADL, the percentage of Americans who reported hearing anti-Semitic remarks plummeted from 64% in 1946 to 16% just 5 years later in 1951. For the next 50 years, it seemed as if there was a consensus that you could not make it in national public life or national politics if you expressed racist or anti-Semitic attitudes. The social constraints and the dropping percentages of those holding anti-Semitic attitudes from the majority into the middle of World War II to the 11% in the last few years here is very encouraging. On the other hand, 11% means it's 25 to 30 million Americans who hold the anti-Semitic attitudes. And while the numbers of the 330 million Americans acting on those attitudes is still very small, every anti-Semitic act damages real people, damages the communities in which they occur, damages our nation. The number of hate crimes targeting Jews has been consistently significantly higher than any other religious group, twice the number of Muslims who are the number two religious victim of hate crimes and persecution here. And we Jews are only half the number of hate crimes aimed at African Americans. And furthermore, in the last 2 decades, and much more so in the last 5 years since President Trump took office, many of those social constraints have been escalatingly dissipating. In recent years, we've seen the explosive growth in America and across the globe of anti-Semitism on the internet, on university campuses, on our streets, attacks against synagogues, schools, community centers, desecration of holy sites, and cemeteries. In recent years, the deadliest attacks against Jews in American history. And of course, it's not just Jews. We've seen in our country not just anti-Semitism, but an explosion of hate groups and the spread of hate speech and hate acts. Hate acts against Jews, Asians, Muslims, Sikhs, LGBTQ, women, African Americans in escalating numbers. Here in Texas, 2022 was the highest instance of hate crimes since they began keeping records. The 6th year in a row that there was some increase. African American LGBTQ people in Texas were the highest, largest number of hate crimes, but the rate in relation to population of LGBTQ and Jews were the highest here. Across America, Catholics, LGBTQ plus, Asians, blacks, all face these kinds of increases. And we've witnessed the degradation of civil discourse, first in the dark corners of the internet, then more publicly exacerbated by the anonymity of social media and the stamp of approval of such rhetoric by too many leaders in our nation. And the damage such hate crimes inflict on the victims of America is great, both as a national and a communal response is called for. For hate crimes are more than mere acts of violence. They're more than murders and beatings and arsons and desecrations. Hate crimes are nothing less than attacks on the values that are the pillars of our republic, the guarantors of our freedom. They are a betrayal of the promise of America. They erode our national well-being. Those who commit those crimes do so intending fully to tear at the too often frayed threads of diversity that bind us together and makes us strong. They seek to divide and conquer. They seek to tear us apart from within, pitting American against American, fomenting violence and civil discord. As Dr. King said in the wake of the Birmingham church bombing, those 4 girls who perished have something to say to every politician who has fed his constituents with the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely with who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderer. In the end, whether in the U.S. or globally, we must confront, delegitimize, and combat anti-Semitism, recognizing the paradox that anti-Semitism is capable of taking on its own life regardless of what else is happening in our society, even while we recognize that unless we ensure religious freedom, safety at sites of worship and other holy sites for all peoples and all religions, unless we ensure an end to acceptable hate speech, and unless we ensure vigorous efforts against hate crimes, against any marginalized group, neither American Jews or any other group will be safe here. What has been so extraordinary is how the religious and civic communities of America in interfaith coalitions that really mark America have arisen to come together after racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, Islamophobic tragedies have occurred. Muslims cleaning up desecrated Jewish cemeteries in St. Louis and Philadelphia. The presidents of both our synagogue and a church in McClellan, Texas, handing keys to the imam of the mosque to use their houses of worship as long as they needed. Cleaning up together graffiti, repairing vandalism, the entire community around Tree of Life and Mother Emanuel, and so many other places that have been attacked, standing in solidarity with those so tragically victimized. All of this working in broad-based interfaith and intergroup coalitions that are the hallmark of America to delegitimize hate acts and hate speech. Indeed, it is encouraging to note that we live at a moment where there is more interfaith engagement, comedy, and cooperation in America and globally than we have ever seen in human history. And when people come together across political, religious, cultural lines to build a better America for all, they are modeling the very kind of America we hope to create. And we look to all of our political, religious, cultural, and civic leaders to help in achieving this. Such coalitions as your institutions have been part of are indispensable and a model for others to engage in this work. And when in all of Jewish history have we ever lived in a nation whose leader issued a whole of government, whole of society strategy to combat anti-Semitism, and to do it in an intersectional manner that recognizes both the distinctive of anti-Semitism and what needs to be done to combat it, but simultaneously recognizes that we are all in this together. And in order to fight anti-Semitism, you got to fight racism and Islamophobia and homophobia and every other kind of phobia that marks our society. This is something really extraordinary. So these kinds of, now during much of this time, the Supreme Court served on the local, as a check on local, state, and federal legislative failures and executive branch abuses. It was a driving force for the expansion of such right. In the lifetimes of some in this room, this was the High Court's role throughout the entire Warren and Burger courts, even through much of the Rehnquist court. Indeed, many of the most progressive justices on civil liberties, civil rights, women's rights, separation of church and state on those courts, including Warren, Burger, Blackmun, Brennan, O'Connor, Souter, all were Republican-appointed justices. Academic studies have shown there was almost no difference on women's rights, civil rights, and church-state cases in the votes of Republican and Democratic-appointed justices. All in all, the Supreme Court thwarted the wish list of the conservative right agenda in America. And we lose sight of that. It didn't overturn Roe v. Wade up to the point I'm talking about through the Rehnquist court. It didn't bar race-based remedies to discrimination. It didn't curb the regulatory power of federal agencies. It didn't constrain the impact on policing of the Miranda warnings. It didn't make individual gun ownership a constitutional right. It didn't weaken church-state separation while expanding religious freedom protections to a point that it tipped the balance in a way that is unhealthy. However, since the Roberts Court began in September '05, there has been a marked shift involving retractions of civil liberties, women's rights, voting rights, and other civil rights, with some notable exceptions, particularly in the expansion of LGBTQ plus rights, and an alarming weakening of the wall separating church and state, while expanding gun rights and offering a sweepingly broad view of religious freedom. Linda Greenhouse, the respected New York Times reporter on the Supreme Court for decades, talks about this dynamic I'm talking about, of how those courts really push back on the conservative right agenda. But she pointed out, I believe in her July 10th, I think it was, a reflection, which I urge you all to read, reflecting on the Roberts Supreme Court, 18 years of it. She said, by the time the sun set on this term, on June 30th, the term's final day, every single goal on the conservative wish list has been achieved. All of it. To miss that remarkable fact is to miss the story of the Roberts Court. Now, to be fair, one can nuance this to say that at several times they were looking for some kind of balance, intentionally not giving the right everything they wanted. Whether that is incremental, that it has not given the right yet everything it wants, or whether that is intentional, legal scholars differ on. And we don't know the answer to that. We won't until we see how the next set of cases, since they've come up to the line of tipping the scales in a completely different direction than the past on almost every one of these, some of which are already tipped. But the remaining ones, particularly in the religion clauses, are going to come very, very soon. And here's a couple of other things. In the cases before Roberts Court, almost all dealt with the rights, protection of rights of minority religions. In the Roberts Court, it's almost always protection of Christian rights. In the Warren Court, from 53 to 69, religious claims prevailed 46% of the time. Maybe there should have been more. That's not the point. I'm just look at the pattern. 46% of the time. In the Burger Court, 69 to 86, it rose to 51%. In the Rehnquist Court, it went up to 58%. And in the Roberts Court, '05 to the present, it jumped to 81%. And before 2015, votes for or against religious claims did not correlate with party affiliation or appointment. Now they very much mark that divide. America's hyper-partisanization, which has long divided Congress, the loss of the bipartisan coalition of decency that passed almost every single one of the major achievements in America's social, economic, and civil rights arena in the 20th century, have now marred the High Court as well. No wonder its popularity and trust polling levels have plummeted. And of course, on the list of abandonment or overruling entrenched precedent is the Dobbs decision just a year ago, which overturned Roe v. Wade and ended federal protections of the right to choose for those pregnant people. And what happened when Dobbs came down? Exactly what happened when the Roberts Court Shelby decision struck down crucial segments of the Voting Rights Act. Hundreds of efforts in states across the country were proposed that would curtail voting rights. 29 states actually passed laws, at least one such law. Over 100 laws restricting voting rights passed altogether. If you want a picture of how the country has changed during the Roberts Court era, consider the Voting Rights Act. The last time that there was an actual vote on reauthorization was in 2006. It passed unanimously in the Senate. It passed 390 to 33 in the House of Representatives. It was signed by a Republican president. Today, I don't think we would get one vote from the Republican Party for the original Voting Rights Act. What a statement about the divisiveness in American life. We used to be able to say that one of the few places that people across the political spectrum got together were in our churches. But now the polls show that political views drive people to more fundamentalist churches and liberals to more liberal churches. You know, this religion can play a crucial role, but only when we're willing to work together in coalitions across some of the theological and ideological divisions. And that's exactly what happened in Dobbs. 21 states have passed the laws. Here in Texas, you know the situation better than I do. State courts have blocked in 7 states on privacy grounds, due process grounds, but religious freedom and establishment clause challenges as well. We've had those kind of challenges, not just here in Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Utah, Wyoming. People are in a violation of my religious right. I believe religiously I'm entitled to an abortion. I'm compelled to get an abortion. And the religious freedom claims. Some of these claims I think are stronger than others. Some are weaker than others because of time. If you want my opinion on which are going to win and lose and why, ask it during the discussion period. Let me turn to the Supreme Court in the religion clauses. As I said, like many of the promised rights, it took 150 years to really have them implemented in a way that made the promise real. Let me take the Establishment Clause. In 1947, the Everson case came down. It's an extraordinary case where the court explained why the Establishment Clause was, in the view of the framers, so necessary. A large proportion of the early settlers of this country, the justices wrote, unanimously, came here from Europe to escape the bondage of laws, which compelled them to support and attend government-favored churches. Centuries before and contemporaneous with the colonialization of America have been filled with turmoil, civil strife, and persecutions, generated in large part by established sects determined to maintain their absolute political religious supremacy. With the power of government supporting them, at various times and places, Catholics had persecuted Protestants. Protestants had persecuted Catholics. Protestant sects had persecuted other Protestant sects. Catholics of one shade of belief had persecuted Catholics of another shade of belief. And all these groups had, from time to time, persecuted Jews. To force loyalty to whatever religious group happened to be on top and in league with the government of a particular time and place, men and women have been fined, cast in jail, cruelly tortured, and killed. As I traveled across the globe in my capacity as America's ambassador for religious freedom on behalf of religious groups facing persecution, ethnic cleansing, arrest, torture, simply because they worship God differently than their majority neighbors or do not believe in God. I can tell you how relevant the Everson Court's warning remains. As I consider some of the claims and agendas proposed by some of the more extreme voices in the Christian nationalist communities, I hear echoes of the Everson warning coming to fruition as well. And the patterns of the Establishment Clause meant many things about the relationship of government and religion, but for time, let me just mention two, because they're two of the most essential ones. First, the cases barred direct government financial support for religious activities and what the court called pervasively sectarian religious entities. That's houses of worship, parochial schools, missionizing groups in which religion was so infused with the institution, you really couldn't separate it out. Because religious institutions could get government money for secular purposes. So if they were running a feeding program, they would do it. But the pervasively sectarian groups theoretically have to separately incorporate that entity to receive the money. That's the way it used to be. The court has chipped away on that in many different ways. It's allowed for indirect aid through vouchers and tuition tax credits and tuition payments. That's the case in Maine that just came down a year ago, indicated the Carson case. It began to allow direct funding to churches, but only for things like playgrounds and funding to beef up building security, not for things that had religious content. Even to today, the court has never upheld direct government funding of religious activities. If it goes to an individual, just like if you get Medicare, you can go to a religious hospital, you can bring it to a religious school and use it for religious purposes, but not direct funding. But now, out of Oklahoma, the Catholic Church there has set up a charter parochial school and is asking for direct government support. This will quickly go up to the Supreme Court. The second line of cases was school prayers, Bible readings in schools. For decades, the court struck down Bible readings, classroom recitations of the Lord's Prayer, graduation prayers, prayers at football games, in schools where, after all, children are required to be, and they are at such an impressionable age. The High Court traditionally held high levels of concern about religious activities in school, most particularly when they were school or teacher organized, encouraged, or led. The Roberts Court has upheld increasing instances of prayer in all kinds of governmental settings, even sectarian prayer. And in the Kennedy Bremerton case a year ago, the football coach case, went to the 50-yard line here and organized prayers after the football games. His right to do so was upheld. But it was upheld on the premise that he couldn't actually pressure the kids to participate. And he hadn't done that, they said, although the record seemed absolutely clear that many students felt that he had done just that. It will be interesting to see if that line holds. If coaches and teachers can organize prayer around official school activity and encourage directly or indirectly students to participate, this will be a sweeping shift in constitutional law and in our public schools and further divide America. We'll await the next case. With almost every aspect of the Establishment Clause jurisprudence having been rejected, abandoned, limited, ignored, under pressure, here it is not clear how much of the Establishment Clause is left. And this country is the most religiously diverse country in the history of the world. Sociologists tell us there are 2,000 religions, denominations, sects, many of them very small and strange and different, and I know what you're thinking. I know, and you're right. 1,900 of them are in California. Here. Nonetheless, the last thing we need is to have sectarian battles over who's going to get the government money and who won't. Whose prayer is going to be said and in the schools or I loved in Texas, you guys came up with the idea of posting the 10 Commandments, but it had to be the King James Version. I once had a debate on television. 4 times I debated Jerry Falwell on these issues. And we had this debate and I said, look, Are you going to use the Douay version? You're going to use the Hebrew, the Jewish version? Whose version? You go, I'll make a deal with you. I'll stop my fight if you put it up in the original Hebrew, because then we know it's right. And he said, no, that wouldn't do any good. The last thing that we need is these kinds of divisive sectarian battles that we've been scared. The religious right has foisted a myth on America that somehow separation of church and state is anti-God or anti-religion. Nothing can be further from the truth. It is precisely the wall that has kept government out of religion, that has allowed religion to flourish with a robustness and strength in America unmatched anywhere in the democratic world today, except for India. All right? But far more than any of the European or Western Hemisphere countries that have established religions, preferred religions, government-sponsored religion. Why in the world with far more people believing in God here, even though the numbers are dropping, far more people saying religious values are central to their life, far more people going to worship still with all of the falling rates that we have. And a lot of those who declare that they're nuns, none of the above, they don't affiliate with anything. We know when we probe deeper, a number of them believe in God, a number of them are spiritually questing. We have to find ways to re-engage them and bring them back. In this, I say, if the Oklahoma Catholic Charter case, the court upholds parochiate finally in this country, resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars being diverted from the public school systems that now educates 80% of American kids to religious schools, America will be a very different country for our children and grandchildren than it was for us. Just a brief word about the free exercise clause. In the beginning of the 40s through the 60s, this expansive interpretation that it was entitled to the same protection as speech, press, etc. That is, if the government was going to restrain religious freedom, it needed a compelling interest and needed to pursue that interest in the way that least limited the exercise of that right, just like all the other fundamental rights we have. And then out of the blue, the Supreme Court, in one of the most remarkable cases in American history, without either side asking them to do, without a single question being asked, took the compelling interest test and threw it in the garbage in 1990 in the Oregon v. Smith case. That immediately led to a reaction. That was really a spectacular moment in the history of our country. In the face of the worst case on religious freedom in the history of America, the entire religious communities and civil liberties communities, left to right, got together, both parties, an overwhelming passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to restore the compelling interest test, and then the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act. I was proud to have played a role in shaping both of those. There was wall-to-wall coalitions, the American Civil Liberties Union and right-wing legal groups, the pro-life groups, the pro-choice groups, pro-gay rights groups, the anti-gay rights groups, all working together. But by the late 1990s, we began to see something new emerge that would fracture that coalition. And that was the religious claim under RFRA to be exempt from civil rights laws. It has become the single most divisive issue on the religious landscape in America. We actually first saw those claims in the 1960s, when individuals and groups started claiming that they had religious principled objections to blacks. Their religion taught them blacks were inferior, and therefore they should be free of the recently passed civil rights laws. The courts found that protections of civil rights was such a compelling interest that allowing such exemptions could open a floodgate of exemption claims that could eviscerate the structured civil rights efforts and struck them down. And in general, we won these latest kind of claims in the 90s, the 2000s, and the teens. The court continued to expand gay rights so long as they weren't pitted against religious freedom claims. The 2015 Obergefell gay marriage case, the 2020 Boston case, which held that Title VII's protection against sex discrimination in the workplace covered LGBTQ people, changed that landscape. Ironically, it energized the pro-gay rights community to want more, and boy, did it energize the anti-gay rights community, making that fight, particularly in public accommodations, particularly stores selling goods or providing services. And they focused in on the gay marriage issue because they could claim, I'm not discriminating against a person. I don't want to have, it's a free speech and freedom of religion claim, not to compel me to create messages that I disbelieve in. The problem, of course, is if you make that religious claim because you think a gay marriage is something God doesn't want, what if you feel that way about miscegenation, about a wedding between a black and a white, between a Latino and an Asian? What if you feel that way about Muslim weddings, or Hindu weddings, or Jewish weddings, or Catholic weddings? You can put a sign outside saying, my bakery services, my floral services, my wedding dress services, not available to gays and blacks and Jews and whoever else is going to be on your list. Where do you draw the line and how? Again, it endangers the entire schema of civil rights that is so necessary, particularly at this moment of divisiveness in America, that we are facing this. And again, after the creative 303 case, we don't know what's in front of us. The court did seem to indicate it would only apply to creative artistry, but who doesn't have creative artistry? The wedding dressmaker, the florist, right? The baker. This is a number of these claims involved. I mean, everyone can claim that there's creative artistry to their work. We just don't know where this is going to end up. But again, this endangers the entire scheme of civil rights. I actually believe that the civil rights community of which I'm a part is right in saying here religious claims should not trump protection of civil rights. I think they're wrong about trying to say we want to pass legislation that will bar someone from making a religious freedom claim about this. I think there are ways to it. Once you say the services have to be provided, that there are ways to accommodate some of the religious freedom claims. There was an entire book written on this that I wrote the cumulative essay on, an academic book, just 3 years ago on this subject. If any of you were interested in taking a look at this more, send me an email and I'll guide you to the book. Here. So, and what was the result of all of these decisions? Here, the same as Shelby and Dobbs. Immediately, states started passing laws once they knew after Dobbs and Create 303 Creative. In Florida, we've seen book bannings escalate. There's 681 books this year alone so far have been banned somewhere in the country. Utah, I love this one, actually banned the Bible from the schools because sex and violence in the Bible. You gotta love it. Texas, our always reliable source, the Ten Commandments you know about, thankfully, that got turned in. Great job, everyone who helped bring that about. But then, authorizing public school chaplains, proposing reinstituting Bible prayers, Bible readings and school prayer here. And just a word about the Ten Commandments. It's so frustrating for me. Does somebody really believe that our classrooms are going to be more ethical because the Ten Commandments are posted somewhere? Even if it isn't the Ten Commandments that the kids in that room know because their religious tradition teaches it differently. If we inscribe the words of the Ten Commandments on the hearts and minds of our kids, in our houses of worship, in our homes, it can make a difference in our classrooms. If all it's going to be is visual muzak, that's an interesting image, visual muzak, hanging on the wall somewhere, I guarantee you it'll do as much for morality in our classrooms as Gideon Bibles have done for morality in our motel rooms here. Look, religion can be used to divide or heal, to bring people together or tear them apart. We know what religion should be doing. We share a common value about this. As my colleague, Rabbi Stacy Friedman, has observed, it is our compassion and our common humanity that defines us. It is the way that people have united as allies and partners in standing up against such hatred that defines us. It is the support so many have shown one another after each attack that ultimately defines us. It is the love and the tears we shed with one another at our vigils. That's what defines us. It is in that spirit that this lecture has every year after year after year given a vision about America that defines us, defines you, defines the world that we dream of. It is in that spirit that we gather here tonight, committed that this uniquely diverse, religiously diverse nation shall remain united. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. May that be the goal, the outcome, the blessing of this lectureship, of Brite, of everything that you folks have dedicated yourselves to. Thank you.